Hello, and welcome to the Gerontological Society of America's Grant Chat, the dollars and cents of National Institutes on Aging grant budgets. I'm Dr. Patty Slatum from the Virginia Center on Aging at Virginia Commonwealth University and a visiting scholar at GSA. GSA's Grant Chats are a series of one-hour virtual sessions designed to bolster a broad range of grantsmanship skills specifically tailored to your work as a gerontologist researcher. Today's Grant Chat explores tips for success and pitfalls to avoid in creating a compelling budget. Are you preparing the budget for your first NIA grant, or are you an experienced investigator looking to hone your budgeting skills? This session is an opportunity to learn from each other, expand our network, and share resources. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to provide a few logistical considerations. Please introduce yourself in the chat. You can use the chat box throughout the presentation to comment or ask questions. Please keep your audio muted until it's time for the discussion. And this grant chat is being recorded and will be available after the event on the GSA website. And I am joined today by GSA Grant Writing Program Workgroup members, Dr. Zach Baker from the Edson College of Nursing and Health Innovation at Arizona State University, Helen Way from Stockton Center of Successful Aging at the School of Business at Stockton University, and Gail Towsley from the University of Utah College of Nursing. And we will serve as your co-moderators.
Thank you, Patty. To open today's grant chat, I would like to introduce our panelists. We are delighted to have a distinguished group of GSA members with us to share their experiences preparing and reviewing NIH grant budgets from different perspectives. First, we welcome Holly Furman, Senior Manager, Research Development from the Emma Eccles Jones Nursing Research Center at the University of Utah College of Nursing. We'd also like to welcome Dr. Joseph Gogler, the Robert Kane Endowed Chair in Long-Term Care and Aging, Professor, Division of Health Policy and Management from the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. And we'd also like to welcome Dr. Glenn McGugan, who's a Program Officer in the Division of Microbiology and Infectious Diseases from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. We look forward to engaging with you for this very important and exciting grant chat.
Hey, hi, I'm Zach Baker. And by the way, if anybody didn't introduce yourself in the chat, I know it feels a little uncomfortable sometimes, and I often didn't do these things, but I really like reading them. So I invite you to throw something in there if you do feel comfortable with it. I know one of these panelists very well. Joe was my mentor, and the other panelists I just got to meet a little bit ago, but I'm pretty excited to talk about this one today. It's kind of one that's been on our list to cover in these sessions for a while. And so I think I'm going to start out this first question going to Joe, and then I'm going to ask Holly to give us an idea of maybe what Joe might have missed or what Holly would ask an investigator to do first. And then maybe we'll go to Glenn next, and Glenn can be like, okay, here's what you guys missed and what you should have done, kind of set us up that way. So Joe, what process do you use or recommend when you're developing a budget for some kind of NIA grant?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think over the years, I've kind of have viewed it as a dual process. One is navigating the internal process at your home institution or department and what's required there. And then secondarily, it's kind of the external process in terms of what's required by the funding institute that you're applying to, whether it's National Institute of Health Institute or some other institute, and how will that be reviewed and appraised by the reviewers. And sometimes those things don't align perfectly. Many of our home institutions often have requirements, timelines and such that in the end, and I hate to say this, might often have very little to do with the quality of the application submitted. So it can be challenging to navigate those two things. Sometimes it's even frustrating too if one isn't used to it, as far as, why am I being asked to sign off on this document or prepare this information or that information, when in the end, it will not contribute at all to the external appraisal of the proposal. But that being said, I mean, I think the first piece of advice, I don't think it takes any expert to say this, is the sooner one can establish a very strong partnership with a grants administrator, like, for example, someone like Holly or others that you know, the better. Understanding what the expectations are in terms of timelines. You have to remember, when working with a grants manager or expert within a department, they probably are navigating and working on multiple proposals at any given time. So working with them carefully, understanding and backing out a timeline as soon as possible is usually pretty critical, particularly when it comes to, say, more complex applications that require more subcontracting, for example. I noticed in the chat some of you are doing Ks. Those grant budgets tend to be very much focused on the individual investigator in terms of their salary effort, maybe a modest amount of research funds, et cetera. But when one starts moving to, say, larger scale R-level grants or even bigger types of projects, often those are going to include multiple investigators of multiple institutions. What does your institution require in terms of that subcontracting process? And I found it varies widely across institutions. Some, and again, depending on the strength of the relationship you have with your grants people, for some, you know, maybe you have some flexibility in what is needed and when it can be done. But for others, there are other institutions that are very much, they have a very strict timeline that these documents, these subcontracts, all this information should be submitted and approved, you know, that X amount of weeks or sometimes months prior to the grant deadline. So, I mean, that to me is some of the tips I have from the internal process. And then the external process, I think you'll probably hear from Dr. McGugan and I think Ms. Furman as well, you know, in terms of what is really required and necessary and important when drafting out that justification from the standpoint of the funding institute, but then also for external reviewers as well. And I'll stop there to give others a chance to talk. And we can certainly talk more about at least what my experiences have been sitting on multiple types of NIH grant review panels and what reviewers are often looking at when they're looking at budgets. So.
Thank you, Joe. I think Holly, he teed it up for you there. He said talk to Holly.
Yeah, I think that was a great response and really touched on a lot of the things that I would also suggest in the process that I would recommend when developing a budget, and just kind of building on some of the things that Joe said. I think, you know, also really looking at your centralized or departmental supportive staff as a resource in the process and not just someone that's going to sort of ensure that you're hitting timelines, but they, like Joe said, they're seeing a lot of budgets. So they have some really good ideas and suggestions and can be really creative in helping you put together a budget that would be meaningful and would hit all the budget limitations. So I would say just really think about who are your resources that would help you put together a strong and meaningful budget that will set you up for success in the post-award period should you be funded. Centralized offices like your Office of Sponsored Projects usually has a lot of resources. Usually they have an Excel sheet with formulas already built in that you can use to develop your budget, and they're usually geared towards NIH budgets with all the spending categories in there. So they directly align with how you're going to put things in your grants.gov application package, or if you use Cayuse or one of those system-to-system softwares. So they really set you up for success and make it really user-friendly if you're using those Excel sheets. They also usually have sample budget justifications. So I would just, my recommendation is really to understand what resources are available to you within your department and your institute to support the process. And don't be afraid also to reach out to your colleagues. Colleagues are often willing to share budget examples. You know, I know salary information is sensitive, but you can easily remove that out and share a budget justification to get some ideas of how, what a strong budget and budget justification would look like.
Thank you, Holly. I think one of the things I'm hearing from both of you here is there are a lot of people around you to whom you can reach out and get some help with a lot of these different things. And maybe one other person we can talk to is our PO. Glenn, would you be willing to pop in here?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. You know, just as Holly mentioned, the institutional resources people definitely need to take advantage of, because these are extremely knowledgeable people. So they've navigated the NIH system or whatever system you're trying to navigate multiple times. From the NIH perspective, when you contact a program officer, obviously we're dealing more with the scientific side, but we can help you understand how to develop your budget so that how it's going to be seen in review from that perspective. And we can get into more of the nuts and bolts, as we go along. But basically, the way I think about it is drafting your specific aims, thinking about the types of experiments you're going to do, and then the amount of money that you think you're going to need to accomplish those things. And that's really the largest portion of your budget is going to be personnel. So really thinking about, who do I need to work on this particular project and how much effort do they need? And that's going to be a big bulk of your particular application. And then from there, you really need to pay attention to the funding announcement, because there are going to be budget caps in the funding announcement. And you need to know, do I need to use a detailed budget? Do I need to use an itemized budget? Those kind of things, if there are restrictions, things like that. So I think that's where your program officer and your grants management specialist can also help you on the NIH side. But we can get more into that as we go along.
Thank you, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for the panelists. Let me take on the second question. So what tips can you share for enhancing the budget to strengthen the overall grant proposal? So last February, I have attended the NIH conference of budgeting, and Glenn and Emily has shared lots of insights on the budget preparation for the NIH proposal. So how about this time? Let's first invite Dr. McGuigan to give us some insights. So what tips can you share for enhancing the budget to strengthen the overall proposal?
Yeah, a few of the things that I think about related to the overall budget from the NIH perspective. The first thing to remember is that the budget is not a scoreable item during peer review. So they're going to discuss the science first, and then they're going to comment on the budget later. That being said, if you significantly overestimate or underestimate your budget, this is going to really signal to reviewers that maybe you don't understand the scope of the project that you're proposing. And that's really going to negatively impact your overall impact score and how the reviewers view this in terms of feasibility. And as I mentioned earlier, probably the single biggest expense that you're going to have is going to be personnel on your particular proposal. And so if you take nothing else away, make sure that you clearly justify the level of effort for your personnel, the number of personnel that you're proposing. And this will be different depending on the type of study that you're proposing. A clinical study is going to be very different in terms of the types of personnel than some other sort of study that you may propose. So I guess those are kind of the bigger things, making sure that the budget that you're proposing is not too much and it's also not too little, right? So there's this sweet spot. And if you're a new investigator, it's the first time you've done it, you really want to take advantage of those around you, as Holly was mentioning, your peers, so you can get insight, even if you want to remove some specific information. If there are sets of experiments you're proposing that maybe you haven't got a good handle on how much it's going to cost, then your peers can also help you with that, with designing this budget. And then from the NIH perspective, it's really about following the guidelines and the funding announcement and making sure that you clearly justify and use the correct budget type.
Thank you, Glenn. Dr. Gogler?
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, really, really good question. I'll start by, my experience, at least on many kind of different mechanisms, review panels. As Dr. McGuigan stated, I mean, often the bulk of resources in any budget usually goes to personnel, if not always. And most external reviewers, I can't say they're going to be reading line by line everything in the justification. But as an NIH applicant, in a way, you have to be prepared for them to do so. And certainly one area that often gets a lot of attention on panels is effort. Is the investigator putting in enough effort to ensure the feasibility of the project? And as Dr. McGuigan mentioned, a budget is not scoreable. However, if it appears that what you're proposing is not feasible, that that appraisal will end up influencing, I would argue, some of the other scoreable elements of a proposal. Because if you remember, certainly when I'm a reviewer, I tend to review the proposals in order. I don't necessarily go right to the aims and then the research strategy. I actually review it from beginning to end. And at the beginning is the budget and budget justification. So that's among the first narrative documents that at least I review as a reviewer. And if you're already getting a sense that what this person is proposing doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, that could then influence how the reviewer will appraise the remainder of the proposal. And so that gets to something that I think Zach put in the chat and may not prove popular to many of you, but let's see, maybe we can find a middle ground here. So I'm probably on the more of extreme end in this regard, in that I actually do like drafting out my own budget justification. And the reason why I do that is I want to ensure alignment with the justification, with the research design, and all the other elements of the proposal. And if you have someone else doing it, regardless of how skilled they are, they may not include certain aspects that tie together maybe specific approaches that you're proposing as effectively as if you're doing it. So maybe a better way to do it, and I'm sure Zach does this, and maybe some of you here do as well, is, maybe you have, let's say someone like Holly draft out justification narrative using boilerplate or some other, and then you take a look at it and then further refine and edit it. That might be a good way and a good strategy to approach that. But so when I think of putting together a strong budget justification, that's some of the things I'm thinking about. I think the other piece too is, and sometimes applicants put in justifications that are very limited. They don't provide a lot of detail, and maybe they get away with that. I don't know. I really try to address the 5 W's in all of every element of your budget justification: who, what, when, where, why. And kind of drafting all of that out. You won't get necessarily penalized for having a really detailed budget justification. I've never heard a reviewer say, this is too much. Why did this person do that? Versus if you're putting in bullets for your justification. So, I mean, those are, I think, some of, I guess, my hard-won experience in this regard. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Gogler. Ms. Furhan, would you like to share some tips? Thank you.
Sure. I think the tips that were shared ahead were super great, and things that I had thought about in preparing for this question as well. So I think I might take us in a little bit different direction for a tip that's might be a little bit specific. So in the College of Nursing at the University of Utah, we do a lot of social behavioral research and a lot of intervention development and early testing of interventions, which is also something that NIA is really interested in funding right now via the R01 mechanism for ADRD research. To sort of accelerate the research in that area. So one thing that we're often thinking about when we develop our interventions and then accordingly our grant proposals and our budgets is thinking about, how can we engage the populations that we're targeting, health disparity populations or underrepresented individuals in research, and how can we represent that in the proposal and in the budget even. So we've been thinking a lot about engagement and recruitment and retention strategies and making sure our budgets reflect that. So do we want to involve a community advisory board? And if so, composed of individuals from these underrepresented groups, we want to fairly compensate them for what they're contributing to the development of the intervention. Do we want to work with community health workers through community-based organizations to help deliver the intervention or to help recruit and retain participants? If so, we want to accordingly budget for those individuals to pay for their time and effort towards the study. What are some of the recruitment and retention channels that would be most meaningful for reaching these individuals? So really thinking those sorts of things through and really representing that in the budget justification in a meaningful way. Also thinking about how can we improve accessibility and inclusivity and for participating in the research. Is there technology supports that we want to budget for so that people can participate? Do we want to send out tablets or mobile phones with access to intervention platforms to our participants so they can fully participate and not be limited by technology or lack of access to technology? do we want to be budgeting for translation and back translation services so people who speak Spanish or languages other than English can fully participate in the research? Also thinking about personnel, do we want to be hiring study coordinators that are multilingual or have special skill sets? And if so, that might have salary implications for the budget. So these are a lot of things that I would say are a little bit different direction, but some of the things that we are really thinking about a lot more in the College of Nursing when we develop our grants and put together our budgets.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry. I think that's awesome. I love, you can tell when you're talking, Holly, all the different people that you're working with who have very different structures in their grants and the different kinds of things that they might include. You know, I'm pretty aware of what someone like Joe includes in his grants because Joe taught me to write grants, right? But I find myself sitting around the water cooler and talking to folks about like, oh yeah, you could totally put that in there. That would fill that need. So I think it's a really cool set of expertise that you bring to this talk today. And I think I'd actually like to start with you, if that's okay, Holly, for the next question. At risk of airing Utah's dirty laundry, I'm curious if there are common pitfalls that you see when you're helping folks to kind of create those budgets, things you often have to tell people, oh, maybe not quite like this, maybe like this instead.
Yeah, I think one of the most common pitfalls is scope of work to budget. And that's sometimes a really hard balance to make. So I think both Glenn and Joe touched on this earlier, like what is the scope of work that you can do within the budgetary restrictions? And so you're not, over budgeting or significantly under budgeting as well. You want to have this right amount of funds. So, if you're thinking about a multi-site trial with a large, your power calculations come back in, you have a really large sample size, thinking that through with the budget, or do you have enough time in the grant to be able to appropriately follow up people and meet your accrual milestones? So making sure you're striking that balance, of course, in a meaningful way where you're also retaining rigor and reproducibility. So thinking all of those through, I think that is probably one of the things that is a common pitfall that we're trying to consistently adjust for throughout the budgetary process.
But if it's okay, I'd like to pose a similar question to you next. I've noticed that working with different POs at different institutes over the years, there's been pieces of advice they've given me that it's clear like, oh, you've given that before because people have done this before. And so I'm curious what comes to your mind when I ask about common pitfalls in budget.
Yeah, so I would echo what Holly said in terms of under budgeting. That's a common thing that we see, and that will affect it will be accepted by the NIH because technically, you can submit whatever budget you want within guidelines. But then when it goes to review, it's not going to fare very well. The other things that I've seen is people not following what's written in the notice of funding opportunity. So maybe a detailed budget is required and they submit a modular or vice versa. So that would be the next pitfall, is using the incorrect budget type. So if you're proposing $250,000 or less, in general, you're going to want to use a modular budget, or you have to use a modular budget. If you are at a foreign institution, you have to use an itemized budget. If there are other, restrictions in the funding announcement, you may have to use a detailed or itemized budget as well. And then the other common thing I see is a failure to separate subaward consortium budgets. This is a common pitfall. And I would say the last one is not seeking prior approval for a budget that exceeds 500,000 direct costs minus consortium F&A per year. And so if you submit that, even if it is the best science in the world, CSR is going to reject it, the Division of Receipt and Referral, unless you have a letter from the Institute stating that they're willing to accept it. So, those are kind of non-science-y like rules and regulations, government wise, that you want to avoid, and those are kind of some of the things that I see.
That was a really cool list. Thank you. Some of those I anticipated, but some of those I didn't. So, Joe, I'm gonna throw it to you next. You've applied for quite a few different kinds of grants. If there's an activity award, Joe's probably applied for it at some point. So, I'm curious if there are any pitfalls that seem to have come up across those that might be common to them.
It's a good question. I think the ones that I've seen, we've already discussed to some extent, which is maybe proposing a project or scope of activity that is too ambitious for the particular mechanism. And again, it can be very challenging from a scientific standpoint because we may know and realize that we have to do it this way, whether it's a certain how a study is powered, for example, longitudinal scope, all these different elements, and they just might not fit the available budget for that particular mechanism. And that can be really challenging in trying to find a middle ground that still allows one to be competitive. And I think that's often a big pitfall, but it's also a pitfall that can be addressed. And I know it's not always possible, but can be addressed with planning, is thinking through and taking time to understand and getting feedback from others, not just in terms of the administrative side and budget, but then also scientifically about, are there ways to still pursue my specific aims that are scientifically viable? But that often will take time and requires feedback as well. I mean, one thing if I, in my, again, admittedly limited perspective and set of observations is, I think sometimes junior scholars may underestimate the amount of time it takes to put all of this together, particularly at the NIH standpoint. The amount of time it takes not just to do specific aims and research strategy, which is daunting enough. Certainly if one wants, and one certainly is advised to be getting the sufficient amount of both internal and external feedback on all of that. But if, for example, as Holly had mentioned, if one is proposing an intervention, one then has to start preparing the human subjects clinical trial section, which is by no means easy. Particularly for the first time, along with the justification, along with all these other things like formatting a biosketch so it's personalized for that proposal, ensuring all my co-investigators are doing the same thing. I mean, again, the list just goes on, where for those of us that maybe aren't as used to the process, really means that one has to build as much time as possible to prepare. So, I mean, if there's any tip I could give, it would probably be that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Gogler. So I know there are many people in the audience are new investigators. So my next question is, what advice do you have for new investigators preparing for their first NIA grant budget? So this time I want to start with Ms. Furman. Could you share? Yeah. Sure.
I think Dr. Gogler just ended his last tip with a really great advice for new investigators, starting early. And also one thing to think about is, what can be really frustrating when you're working sort of last minute on a budget is a small change can have massive waterfall effects throughout the entire proposal. And in particular, the budget and the budget justification that can throw your budget completely out of whack. So for instance, actually, we re-examined our power calculations and we really need to change our sample size and we need to change our follow-up timeline. And that can have massive implications that can be really challenging to make consistently throughout the entire application last minute. So working ahead and making sure you really nail down those specific aims and your approach and your study timeline early are really important. And then for new investigators, working closely with those who have prior experience, so bringing on somebody onto your research team, maybe a senior investigator that can advise and mentor you through the budget. Also working with your administrative support personnel in your department and at your centralized offices to support you, and seeking review. So a lot of people I know seek mock reviews or, pay for consultant type reviews of their spec aims and research strategy. I would advise go ahead and include your budget justification with that review as well to help ensure that they are all in alignment and communicating with each other. So I think that would be a really important and critical process for new investigators.
Thank you, Ms. Furman. So Dr. Gogler, I think just now you mentioned some tips for the new investigator. Do you want to add more?
Yeah, I think prep time. I think Dr. McGugan raised a really, really good point, which is really knowing the RFA that you're applying to. It's very easy to miss some of the details. And again, sometimes working closely with a grants manager expert to then also become familiar with what's called assist. Now, I'm not suggesting as a PI you should be going in assist and uploading everything. Usually that is what an experienced grants manager will do. But one thing I've been starting to do that's helped me, particularly with more complex RFAs that have a lot of different elements, is sometimes I will go and look at the assist page, which and I think most PI should at least have access to, and actually see what are the specific documents required on assist itself. And one thing I've been taking to start doing is I actually go through and confirm, okay, this particular RFA will need X, Y, and Z, all these different documents, these particular documents in the human subjects clinical trial section, the list goes on and on. Then I actually build out that list and I have a better understanding, what exactly do I need to do or do others need to do to pull all this together? I found that to be pretty helpful. Again, most of the standard mechanisms, it's fairly, at least with experience, but certainly after reviewing an RFA in depth, it should be pretty straightforward what is required. But sometimes when one is applying for different mechanisms, you may just assume experience will take you through, and then all of a sudden you find out you need something that you didn't expect. And I'll give you a story related to this, which is very embarrassing. Now, luckily, this grant actually scored fairly well. I personally think it should have been funded. It wasn't. That's a whole nother story, but a whole nother panel. But in any event, so I had applied for this mechanism called an R35, never had before, but I thought it was a really good fit for some of the work we're doing. Pulled it all together, put the research strategy together, 12 pages. I just assumed, well, it should be 12 pages. So I provide all the documents to my grants manager. Guess what? Grants manager comes back and says, hey, we're getting an error. Your research strategy is only supposed to be 6 pages. So I had to cut down. Imagine after you've edited, finalized everything, within like half a day, you got to cut it in half, Joe. So I did, but you don't want to ever be in that situation. That was not fun. Like I said, luckily it still was well received, but nonetheless, these are the kinds of things where, again, planning preparation, not assuming you know everything just because you've done it before, is very wise. So don't make the mistakes I have. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gogler. And it's very, this actually, I made a similar mistake. And thank you for sharing this story. Dr. McGuigan, would you like to share your suggestions from an perspective?
Those are really, really good suggestions. A couple of things I would add, kind of piggybacking on what Joe said, is that one thing that I see a lot from new investigators particularly is that they are really excited about their area of research and they try to put 20 years worth of science into one application, their first application. And it's really about scope, right? What can you reasonably do within the years of that particular type of grant, maybe 5 years, 3 years, whatever it may be. The other thing is the question that I often get is, how much effort should I devote to my application as a new PI? And there is no one right answer for that, right? So it really depends on what you're proposing. But as a general rule of thumb, and I can only speak for AI because those are the types of grants that I see the most, but maybe my colleagues can speak about NIA, but I would say that around 25% is probably a sweet spot to begin with. So lower than that may raise questions as to your effort for that particular type of application. And then the other is, as a new PI, usually you're going to want to use a modular budget as opposed to a detailed or itemized budget. Unless you are proposing a very large clinical type study where it's going to cost you more than $250K per year. With the modular budget, you're going to get less questions. So the more details you put in the grant application, the more there are for reviewers like Joe to look at and to comment on. And so with the modular budget, yes, they can still cut modules if it's not appropriate, but you kind of help yourself out a little bit along those lines. So those are just some of the things.
25%. I'm totally writing that down. Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe one of the other members wants to, I don't know how that jives with what they see for NIA though. So
I can just add that that's usually our kind of rule of thumb is 25 to 30% FTE is what we like to see. Of course, with an MPI application, sometimes it's more in the 20 to 25% range for both of the MPIs. If it's 2, if you're talking about more than 2, then that might even get a little bit lower. As far as I'm aware, NCI is the only institute that has set minimal level of efforts for PIs. They actually have minimal level efforts that have to be met. So if you're applying to NCI, you just might want to be aware of those. I've put the notice in the chat for that. But I'm not aware of any other institute having a similar policy, and certainly not NIA as far as I'm aware.
Joe, anything you want to offer on top for the discussion of effort there?
Yeah, I think these are all good points. I like the idea of 25%. I think in reflecting on my own proposals when I go in as the sole PI, that's probably on average what I try to put in, sometimes more, particularly if it's like an R01 level grant and it's an intervention, of course. I mean, these things take a certain amount of time and you want to be cognizant of how much time should be set aside for that. You know, I have heard this through back channels, so take it for what it's worth, but for some investigators, you know, what sometimes happens is they may propose. Now, if you recall, when you submit a grant, you do not have to provide your current other support with that proposal. So you could very foreseeably propose a % effort that actually exceeds your current other support. And if you get funded, you know, then that's a whole set of challenges you and perhaps working with your grants manager may have to navigate, which is, I got a grant. And again, this kind of at one level, you're like, well, how's that a problem, Joe? That's wonderful. But in reality, that can cause significant challenges as well. And maybe this is a whole nother topic for more post-award proposal, you know, post-award preparation tips. But when trying to navigate your current other support with a grant that may have just been funded, how do you ensure that you maintain the spirit of what you just were awarded, but then also are still able to do your other projects? Again, I think for many of us, particularly those of us in the early career stages, that's maybe less of an issue, hopefully, but nonetheless, that is something that can come up too. And that in and of itself is a challenge. And again, I won't speak for Glenn, but I know other program officers I've worked with. I mean, you know, that is not the type of relationship you want to establish with a program officer where you say, you put myself in for 40%. Oh, Glenn, do you mind? I want to put myself down 20% now so I can fit in other support. That's not a good approach. You know, that's not how you want to do it. So be careful and think about that as well in the context of not just the project, the singular project you're putting in, but your overall support picture. And it's different for all of us given our roles in terms of teaching and other things, but think about that too, because I think that is really important.
And any reactions to that from the kind of official world?
Yeah, no, those are excellent points. And we see this often. So if you are awarded and you're over effort, like your total, obviously you can only have 100% effort across the board. And if you're over that on your commitment, then you're going to have to reduce your effort on some place. And if that % reduction in effort is over a certain amount, then the grants management specialist is going to reach out to the PO and say, is this scientifically feasible? And you don't want to be in the situation where, hey, I propose to do all this work and now I'm going to cut my effort in half. And the PO says, well, scientifically, this doesn't make sense. And so then you're going to have to change the scope of your award. That could affect your budgets. And so it's just not a situation you want to be in. So that's really good advice.
You know, my next question actually kind of, I think this is one example of what I might be talking about in the next question. I'm curious how each of you thinks about budgeting with change in mind. So, you know, it might be that 2 grants come in and so you don't have the effort to give to either one that you initially planned, or it might be that you hire a coordinator and the market is such that that person costs $20,000 more than you thought they would, or you have to spend more on recruitment, or yeah, how do you budget with the anticipation that things are going to have to change and you're going to need to, in some ways, rewrite that budget? I'll let you guys choose who goes first on that one.
I can take a quick stab, and Holly can correct me on this as well. For most grant types, and certainly from the NIH perspective, you are given a certain amount of latitude to rebudget between categories. Obviously, if it's over a certain amount, you're going to have to seek prior approval to be able to do that. The other thing is that when you're building your budget, like say if it's a clinical study or depending on the type of research, then it's understood that you may have it loaded either at the front or at the end, right? So maybe you're going to do data analysis or sort of toward the end. And so the budget personnel wise might be less. And so you may have to shift things around that way. And that's totally allowable so long as you justify it in your application so that reviewers understand why your year one budget is so much larger than your year four budget, for example. And so it's impossible to anticipate every single thing that may occur during the 5 years of your project. And the NIH understands that as well. We're all scientists here as well. And so, you know, you're given quite a bit of latitude to kind of fluctuate that. And then if you're in a situation where, let's say you have just an unanticipated increase in costs, your animal costs doubled, or from your supply or something like that, a piece of equipment breaks that's necessary for your, then we do have administrative supplements that are possible with the NIH, with some in your institute. So you can talk to people at your institute as well about how to do some cost sharing, things like that.
I think that's just also where really, especially when you're doing your pre-award budget, to not underestimate the costs, because there are always going to be unexpected changes. And so if you already start off with a budget that's very underestimated, then you're likely to encounter problems post-award and your ability to meaningfully carry out the research with the budget that you have in hand. So really thinking through what all the costs are and making sure you're accounting for all of them. And maybe some of those, maybe post-award, some of those costs turn out not to be actual costs. So you have some money to reallocate to some other places. Sometimes that's the case. Usually it's the opposite. Unexpected costs come up, or you've underestimated some costs, but hopefully you have a strong enough budget in the first place that you can find places to reallocate some funds to be able to cover those.
You know, one other quick point I'll make, and again, I feel like we're drifting a little into post-award, but still it's relevant, I think, even for pre-award. I've never done this. I've never worked with anyone who does, but maybe some people may feel, well, you know, I'll propose this in these aims, but if I get funded, I'll build in some flexibility for myself and just not do this aim or just cut back on this aim. The one thing that you all have to realize is you cannot modify aim without program official approval after award. I'm not sure if you all were aware of that, but that's really, really important to note. So when you propose an aims in your grant, that is what you must adhere to and try to achieve. So you don't have flexibility after you get awarded saying, well, you know, I put in this last aim because I thought it was kind of a cool idea, and you know, but it looks like now because of some of these budgetary issues, I'm just going to cut it out. You can't do that. So just remember that too, is your aims, in a way, it's almost like the contract you have with the National Institutes of Health, but then also the contract you have with the larger community of people you're working with, whether they're participants, you know, the public or whatnot. That is what you said you proposed you're going to do. You must do your utmost to do that. I mean, it's not like flexible. It's not really that flexible in that regard. So that, I think, is an important thing to note.
Yeah, thank you. Helen, do you want to throw another one in there? Because I have a million questions. I could go all day.
I think maybe Gail have questions from the audience.
Oh, cool. Gail, do you have any questions from the audience?
We haven't had any in the chat, but maybe if there's anyone that has a burning question that would just like to pose it live, that would be great. Otherwise, we can always count on you, Zach.
All right. So one of the things I was thinking about is in the last cycle, Joe, you sent in applications for a few different activity codes, and you had stuff that was more center-y, stuff that was more training-y. I know you've recently done career development, and then there's always research project level stuff. I'm curious if you think if anything comes to mind where you're like, this is wildly different about the way this kind of award works, and if you ever want to apply for this award, you should know this.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Zach. And I think some of you might be going through this yourselves now, just based on what I'm seeing in the chat and the introductions, is clearly writing a career development award versus writing a standard R grant, very different. I think many of you know this already in terms of, vis-a-vis the K grant, balancing out your career training development plan with a research strategy itself. Which again, in our level mechanisms, it's all about the research that's being proposed. So those are very different. And I think it requires a certain balancing act in a K that might not necessarily be required in, say, an R03, R21, R01, et cetera. I think as one moves later into their career, yes, there might be these opportunities to start helming other types of mechanisms. And in reflecting on my career, I think I've been very lucky in that National Institutes of Health, National Institute on Aging have offered me opportunities to review the types of proposal mechanisms that eventually I might become interested in pursuing. One example would be, for example, training grants, T32s. Very, very different to write a training grant than an R grant or a K, quite frankly, any type of K. But having the opportunity to review those helped me kind of understand how those should look like. I mean, what helps them become competitive. And maybe that is a piece of advice to give to all of you is to really best understand what these competitive proposals look like beyond your peer network is, if you have that opportunity, is to serve as a reviewer. Particularly an NIH grant reviewer, if NIH is going to be the funding source that you're most likely to pursue. For example, I noticed one person in the chat said they're working on an SBIR. SBIRs are very different than R21, R03s. And I actually sat on one of those panels some time back as well. And it was very eye-opening. Because remember, an SBIR, your review panel will be some researchers and a lot of people helming companies. So how they review these proposals are going to look different than, say, your standard R03, R01 panel. Okay. So serving as a reviewer to me was really helpful and essential when pursuing some of these different types of mechanisms. Like, we put in, what was that? R25, which is basically like a T32 for undergraduates. So, reviewing and serving on those panels for T32s helped me, I think. We'll see what the score is. Maybe it didn't help at all. Who knows? But I mean, I'm hopeful. And it extends to these different types of things, like, for example, program project grants. Again, very different, certainly center grant proposals. I mean, these are things, many of you are looking at, if not now, maybe in the future. The best way to learn is to review, I think. That's just been my experience anyway.
Can I just say that is excellent advice. That's something that I often advise new investigators as well, to try to serve on a panel. CSR has a early reviewer program. I would suggest, there was a question in the chat that you reach out to. There is an email and a process you can use, but if there is a particular panel that normally reviews grants in your particular field, you can reach out to the scientific review officer and say, hey, I'm a new investigator in this field. I'm interested in learning more about the review process. I'm open to be considered for one of these panels, to kind of establish that relationship with them. Because seeing what happens in the review process, seeing the types of things that reviewers mention, is extremely helpful when you're crafting your own applications, because then you kind of see what is happening after your application is submitted and when it's reviewed.
Yeah. I mean, would you all like to hear another embarrassing story? I'm happy to share one. I think these are always good, right? So, Glenn, you're so right, Glenn. And so I had put in a center grant 5 years ago. It was back in 2018, and it didn't get scored. I put so much of my time and effort into that, and for it not to get scored was, it was challenging. Even, 5 years ago, I was still, fairly advanced in my career at that point. It was hard to take. But then as I started, as NIA, the scientific review staff would reach out to review, different types of grants, I tried to take that opportunity to review similar types of grants, program project grants, center grants, whatever. And by serving as a reviewer on that, and I should have even known this at that point, but nonetheless, by serving as a reviewer, I really then started to see, okay, now I can see why this proposal didn't do well, why it wasn't effective. And again, it was a hard-won piece of experience that I'm really hoping none of you have to go through, but that's kind of why it was so valuable to me. Now, again, who knows? Maybe my most recent Senate grant, it comes back and doesn't get scored again. I'll have to learn again what I did wrong. But I mean, this is the process we're into. Very circular. It's not always linear. It doesn't always go upward. But nonetheless, I'm hopeful that at least it'll be more competitive this time. So. To put that in context too, this was an RFA that only comes out every 5 years too. So I had 5 years to stew on it. I mean, so it wasn't like, well, next year we'll just go in again or next cycle. That's not how this one worked. So, but again, in a way, that was a blessing in disguise because that was probably the amount of time it took for me to understand what needed to happen to make something like this competitive. So.
I love embarrassing Joe stories. I've heard that one.
Yeah, there's plenty. Oh, there's plenty. Zach, no, there was plenty. Trust me.
Maybe we should have Joe back. He does a great talk on his anatomy of failure and shows you like the red spots in his NIH and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it to a close here. But first, I'd like to ask you to each share kind of a final pearl of wisdom, right? The one thought that you want everybody to walk away from you. So Holly, if we could start with you.
Yeah, I think as a member of supportive staff that's here to support you in this process, my pearl of wisdom is to activate your supportive staff and really engage with them and really view them as a partner in the process rather than somebody that's just setting up. Sometimes we can be seen as someone that's just there enforcing deadlines or internal restrictions or policies or things like that, but really we're here to support you. And we have a lot of experience and have seen a lot of budgets usually over the years and can be really helpful and really creative in helping you put together a meaningful budget. So that's also your departmental staff, your centralized office staff. Also, even if you have research managers or study coordinators, they're the ones that are really, doing the day-to-day work and really know what the real costs of the research are or what sort of costs are being overlooked, overestimated, or underestimated. So really activate those personnel to help you in putting together a meaningful budget.
That's solid advice and full circle too. It's kind of where we started too. Glenn, I'll go to you next. What's your pearl of wisdom, the thing that nobody can forget after hearing you talk?
That's a big ask. I would say that overall, one thing you should take away is, consistent with the experiments you are proposing, not more, not less. And the other thing, as Holly mentioned on the institutional side, at the NIH side, don't hesitate to reach out to your program officer, people like me, your grants management specialists who are going to be the budgetary grants people on the award. Because we've also navigated the system. I've been at the NIH for 15 years now. And so I've seen a lot of different kinds of grant applications, grant types, and errors that are common. And so don't hesitate to engage us. That's what we're here for.
I in support of Glenn's point there, when I switched from K99 to R00, my PO basically found me $90,000 that I thought was just going to disappear, and she made sure it got into my account for me to spend on research. So really talk to them. It's a problem venture. And Joe, I'll turn it to you for your final pearl of wisdom there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've heard multiple of them before. Probably the last thing I'd leave everyone with, particularly when if you're in the earlier stages of your career, is not to get discouraged. Like I said, I mean, there are pearls of wisdom, even when it seems like one is submitting a proposal and not making headway, submitting cycle after cycle, maybe it's not getting scored or it's not getting funded or whatever those reasons are. Is I found in the past with time, even for those proposals that at first glance weren't successful, I've been able to utilize elements of them in other work that has been successful. So the one story I told you before of the grant that, remember, I put in the 12-page, it was a 6-pager, was decided not to be funded, even though, it got a good score. I was able to take elements of that and then rework it into what's called a K7 proposal, which is the Academic Career Leadership Award mechanism that NIA has, and that did get funded. And so, again, these things can build off of each other. It's working closely with mentors and others on your team, with people like Holly, with your program officers and others, to find how you can build off of your work to position it so it can be successful. And it takes time. Like I said, it's not necessarily linear, but it can and does happen if one is strategic and one takes a long view. So
The type of, Stephanie, the type of leadership award he just mentioned was K07. Well, thank you all for those pearls of wisdom. As a next step for everybody listening here, kind of take things to the next level. There's a couple of resources that Patty copied into the chat there that you might take a look at. There's things like how to develop a budget, and also some NIAID resources, which I gotta say are the best resources on grants like across the NIH that I have found. I use them constantly. And then I think I copied under Dr. Howell's comment, the CSR link that Glenn was telling us about earlier, to try to get involved in reviewing research.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
I feel time is so short today. Yeah, we have listened so many useful information, the wisdom, and your insights. So let's please join me to in thanking our panelists for their generously sharing their time, experience, and perspectives with us today. And thank you also to our work group members who planned this grant chat. Thanks to you, our participants, for your questions, comments, and a big thank you to Judy Liu and Patty Slatham from GSA staff for the behind-the-scene coordination that makes our grant chat so successful. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.